Habits and Health, Episode 9. Welcome to the podcast where we give you ideas on habits you can create that will help your health. Today's episode is with Dr Gabrielle Fundaro. She is a doctor, a health coach. She's got a PhD in human nutrition, in food and exercise. Her list of credentials is pretty impressive. And we talk about many different areas today, about body image, about various aspects of health, and obviously we dig into habits as well. So that's coming up very soon. If you do like this episode, why not share it with someone who you feel will get some real value from this? Please do subscribe to the podcast so you can get it every Tuesday lunchtime when it's released. And it would be great if you would leave a review for us. That really lets me know what you think about the podcast, and if there's any areas it can be improved. But it also lets other people know about the more reviews we have, the more likely someone who discovers the podcast, maybe by a search, will actually take a chance and have a listen to it and see what they think. Hope you enjoy this week's episode. Habits and Health. My guest today is Dr Gabrielle Fundaro. How are you doing, Gabrielle?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very kind of jealous at the moment. I was jealous when Shannon came on, your partner in crime, I suppose, we could say, because she was in Bali when I was speaking to her. And now I found out you're about to go to Mexico. Wow, what a life you two have.
I know. She is quite the digital nomad. She was my inspiration to go about life that way for about a year before I settled here in Arizona. So it's an adventure for sure.
And is Arizona where you're from?
No, actually, I grew up for the most part in Michigan. And so I have, over the course of my 30-some years, migrated farther south and then farther west. So Michigan to Virginia, where I stayed for 10 years. And then I was in Georgia for 5, and then nomadic for about a year and a half or so. And just settled out in Arizona here back in August. I bought a house and now like a grown-up, I guess.
And I would have thought that the weather was far better in Michigan than it is where you are now.
Oh my goodness. Oh, if you love 8 feet of snow and perpetual winter, it's great. And I have to say the summers in Michigan are nice. They're a little bit milder than the summers out here. We get up to, I think, like 47 Celsius in the desert here. So, but I love it.
Yeah, I know which one I prefer out of the two. The choice of the two, yeah. So Gabby, tell the listeners about what is it that you do? What do you specialize in?
Oh, that's a good question. So I would say that I wear 2 hats, and one hat fits inside the other. So the biggest hat that I wear is just in helping people figure out what they really want to do and then help them do that. And I ensure that whatever journey we're on, my clients are fully informed and they know that they're in the driver's seat, and I am their travel guide to their destination. And within that, I also have a background in what people would refer to, I think, as gut health. But I have my PhD in the area of human nutrition, metabolism, and probiotic supplementation. So about 10 years ago, before it was super cool, I started studying the gut microbiome. And I had the amazing fortune of spending some 4 years teaching people about it and speaking internationally as part of Renaissance periodization. So at the heart of what I do is providing evidence-based information and dispelling a lot of the myths that are really pervasive, especially in diet culture and sort of the diet culture gut microbiome overlap of gut health.
Wow, there's so much to dig into there. Where to start? Well, let's start with the gut health, because as you mentioned, you kind of alluded to there, it's becoming almost fashionable in the last sort of year for people to be talking about gut health. And but for people, even though I think there's still a lot of people who aren't aware of how important it is. So do you want to maybe let people know why it is so important?
Oh, absolutely. So when people are talking about gut health, I've been asked sort of like the definition of gut health quite a few times, and there's no real definition, not that you would find in a textbook or a research paper. But I think people are mostly referring to the absence of disease in the gastrointestinal tract, comfortable digestion, so a tolerable amount of gas or bloating, comfortable bowel movements, and also, perhaps most significantly, a diverse, resilient, and adaptive group of microbes, so microorganisms that reside in the gastrointestinal tract. And those microorganisms play a very clear role in energy harvesting and nutrient assimilation from our diet. So they take the parts of our diets that we can't really extract energy from, and they extract the energy for us. And they also play a role in immune function, really from the time that we're born. They're helping to educate and mature our immune cells all the way up to current day pathogen defense, that they're helping to control the levels of potential pathogens that we might ingest or be inhabited by. And they also play a role in the periphery, so the tissues outside of the gut. They play a role in skeletal muscle metabolism, our ability to switch between using glucose versus fats for energy. They probably also play a role in behavior and perhaps even mood, and also play a role in the development of all of these systems. And we know the vast majority of this from rodent models, because we can grow rodents or other animals without a gut microbiome, without any microorganisms, and we find that they don't develop normally. And while we don't have any causative links between the gut microbiome and any disease, we have started to identify patterns of differences that we see in people who have various diseases versus those who don't. And so we still aren't sure whether it's the disease that might be causing the different relative abundance of microbes, or the other way around, or if a causal link even exists. But we do see that there's a relationship between health and disease and the microbiome, and also our dietary habits and our physical activity habits as well.
I'm wondering, as you were speaking there, what it is that surprises people most. I mean, some of the things you just said, like, for example, how our bacteria and our gut affects our behavior and our mood. I mean, I would imagine that is as a real surprise for most people.
I think that some people might actually make assumptions that we haven't been able to support yet. So, and it could be because, I'm existing in the realm where people are really excited about gut health, and they're excited about the possibilities, to the point that they might draw conclusions before we actually have the data there, and so people are recommending like probiotics or, certain diets to treat autism spectrum disorder, for example, or other, mental illnesses such as depression or anxiety. And as compelling as the early research is, we don't have strong enough data to indicate that those would be safe or effective. And in some cases, some of the interventions actually seem to make things worse in humans. So we have to be very careful, and, we can be excited, but still also be, I think, cautious about what we're claiming and what we're recommending. But it probably is surprising to some people that we have this sort of bidirectional communication between the gut and the brain. And so via the vagus nerve, so that's the nerve that really controls most of our rest and digest functions, we can communicate in that way. And we actually also even have sort of a separate nervous system called the enteric nervous system that helps to regulate our gastrointestinal function kind of independent from the brain, which is interesting to think about, that it sort of is, it's the second brain. Sometimes people say that.
How much when we are, when we get prescribed antibiotics and so on, How much? How does that affect the microbiome?
It really depends on the type of antibiotic and the microbiome to which it's applied. Right. So there are some antibiotics, and obviously antibiotics are made to kill bacteria, and the vast majority of microbes in our gut happen to be bacteria. So we have not yet refined that type of medicine to be able to just pinpoint the pathogenic or disease-causing microbes. And really, we're inhabited by pathogenic microbes normally. So they're not even always, bad guys. But depending on the type of antibiotic we're taking, we may see pretty minimal effects on just a few different microbes that happen to all have in common whatever it is that the antibiotic acts on. Or we might see really widespread effects. We might see a really large loss of life and diversity in the microbiome. And we might bounce back in a few days or in a couple of weeks, or we might see that there's almost a permanent change, out to 6 months or a year. Now, that being said, it doesn't necessarily mean that change is indicative of a disease state or, dysbiosis that a lot of people are kind of using to mean something bad. It could be that it is just an altered healthy state. It's a new state. So the microbes have adapted to that challenge, and they have maybe changed membership, but they haven't necessarily lost function. So it's not just the members of the community that matter, but it's their function, it's their genetic material. And fortunately, most of us have really resilient microbiomes and a high level of redundancy. So even if we lose a few, the others can sort of pick up the slack and say, oh, well, we know how to metabolize that. So that's all right. This one lost out, and, we'll pick up from there. But when we do see a really large reduction in diversity, then we run the risk of having potential overgrowths of those pathogens that at low levels don't cause any problems. But once they sense that their numbers are increasing and they can potentially overcome host defense, that's when they'll start producing those virulence factors, and they can actually cause disease. And that's what we would see with C. difficile. So that happens in people who are taking really strong antibiotics for a fairly long period of time, that C. diff, which is a normal inhabitant, might start to grow, beyond what is a safe relative abundance, if we want to say that, and then can cause disease.
So what is the issue then when someone is prescribed antibiotics and they don't finish the full course? So what is it that happens there then?
So imagine that you are trying to get rid of a bug infestation in your house. And you have killed all of the bugs that you can see, and some that sneak out and whatnot. And you're kind of like, well, I guess, I don't see any more. And so they must all be gone. And all you've really done is gotten rid of the ones that were, brave enough to come out of the woodwork. And the rest of them are still just kind of hanging out and increasing in numbers, and they're just hiding. And it's kind of like that when we're using an antibiotic and we don't take the full course. We might feel better before it's done, but that doesn't mean that we have really controlled the numbers of pathogens effectively. And what can happen with bacteria is that they can actually transfer their genetic material within one generation. So it's called a horizontal gene transfer. So you may have some bacteria that have developed a resistance to that antibiotic, and that's why they're still alive. And they then transfer those genes, they transfer that resistance to other bacteria around them, and now they also are resistant to that antibiotic. And then as they divide and they start to spread that resistance, now the antibiotic will no longer work. And if you go on to infect someone else with those bacteria, then the antibiotic will not work for that person either. So we have to make sure that we are taking the antibiotic all the way through so that we really suppress those bacteria and they don't have the ability to rapidly multiply and spread that resistance.
Because it's fascinating that the numbers of bacteria compared to cells are, there's no comparison, is there? There's trillions of bacteria, and there's, I don't know how many cells are there?
Yeah. It's interesting the way that statistic has evolved, because it depends on whether you're counting red blood cells as being human cells. So I think the updated version used to be kind of like a 10-to-1 or a 2-to-1, and it's sort of a 1-to-1 of all of the human cells in our body to all of the bacterial cells in our GI tract. But where we're vastly outnumbered is in genetic material. So they have just an amazing magnitude of genes that they can express, whereas humans have a much lower number of genes. So we basically can't engage in as many functions as the bacteria can, and that's really helpful to us, and the bacteria and the other microbes as well. And it's helpful to us because we can kind of outsource those metabolic functions, and they benefit us in that way. And in turn, we feed them and we give them a place to live.
In terms of habits, what are healthy habits that are good for our microbiome?
The foundational habits are nothing super sexy or exciting. I often see people recommending, everyone should take a probiotic. And that's really not the case. Probiotics do have some applications, but they're very, they're specific, they're strain specific. So the type of probiotic that you're taking matters. And they're fairly specific to what they can actually help with. So they have fairly limited applications based on the current data. So the foundational habits that would be most supportive of a diverse and adaptive microbiome would actually be eating a variety of plant foods. So it doesn't have to be vegetables, but fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, things that provide fiber, which is considered a microbe-accessible carbohydrate. So fibers contain chemical bonds that we can't break down with our digestive enzymes. And so they pass to the colon, and then they're metabolized by the bacteria there. And those bacteria will sometimes produce gas, which we have to pass, but they'll also sometimes produce short-chain fatty acids, and those are actually beneficial to us. So along with our diverse and plant-centric diet, because it can be omnivorous, engaging in regular physical activity. So another determinant of microbial diversity is cardiovascular fitness. And it has been illustrated in quite a few studies on various types of athletes and recreational exercisers that people who engage in physical activity tend to have more diverse microbiomes. And there's sort of a dose-dependent relationship there too. So as we engage in more physical activity, we tend to see greater diversity up to a point, because there can also be a point of diminishing returns where maybe we're engaging in a really high level of endurance exercise and at high intensities, and that can cause some GI distress. And not necessarily that directly affects the microbiome, but it can just make it really difficult for us to eat enough and to assimilate nutrients, if we're having really severe stomach pain and loose stool and things like that after a run.
So would it be affected by, if you were doing a lot of anaerobic exercise, would that affect it?
We still don't know that.
Right.
So there are so few studies that have been done on that have even included resistance training and looked at the microbiome. Right. So there have been a couple observational studies that have determined the relationship between microbial diversity and diet in people who are doing resistance training. And what we found is thus far, based on just a couple of studies, that it seems that people who are not ingesting adequate fiber don't seem to fully realize the benefits of exercise on diversity. So it seems that might be sort of a mediator with that, with the relationship between exercise and microbial diversity. And that's been shown in cross-country runners and also bodybuilders. But outside of that, and one other study that I know of that looked at people who are engaging in resistance training and supplementing with whey protein, they weren't really looking at the effects of resistance training. They were just looking at the effects of a whole lifestyle change. And they did see an increase in diversity, but we don't really know exactly why. There are really no other studies that have looked at resistance training or high intensity, sort of like HIIT type workouts. But I have been collaborating with a faculty member out of Lipscomb University in Tennessee on a resistance training study. So we're actually going to be looking at some gender-specific or sex-specific differences in microbial populations in athletes, and then how an intense bout of resistance training might affect intestinal permeability and GI function, and whether some of the GI distress that we experience after intense exercise might be mediated by sex-specific differences in the microbiota.
Yeah, there's so many more questions I'd like to continue with on that whole kind of microbiome area, but let's kind of step back. And what got you into all this in the first place? How did you develop this kind of fascination for this whole area?
Well, it actually was just a serendipitous event, because I started my PhD actually just studying the effects of high-fat feeding on skeletal muscle hypertrophy. And I was in a lab that really studied skeletal muscle physiology and biochemistry. So we were really looking at human metabolism. And part of the study design quite often was the application of something called LPS, or lipopolysaccharide, either to skeletal muscle cells that we had taken out of a mouse or a human, or to live mice that we would inject them with this. And then we would measure changes in metabolic function. And I was curious about what this was supposed to represent. What's the physiological relevance of this injection? And as it turns out, LPS is part of the cell wall of certain bacteria. And when those bacteria die or are destroyed, that LPS, endotoxin is what it's called, can potentially leave the intestines and bind to immune receptors on various tissues throughout the body. And one of those tissues is skeletal muscle. And I thought, well, why don't we look at the gut then? I mean, if this is something that we have seen is associated with high-fat feeding, type 2 diabetes, and the presence of obesity, then maybe we can get to the source and see if there's an intervention available. And initially, there was some resistance because we were not really an intestine lab. We weren't looking at that. It was just, this was sort of like our mode of inducing metabolic inflexibility. But some funding became available to perform a probiotics study. And so we ended up designing the study that would use probiotics as an intervention during a high-fat feeding experiment. So we did this in 2 rounds. We had mice and then we had humans, and it was basically just, several weeks of feeding mice what's essentially like cookie dough. And with the human subjects, they had, really high fat milkshakes and whatnot. And we wanted to see if those probiotics would help to reduce either fat gain or insulin resistance, or offer some protective mechanism against the associated inflammation. And it was really just a means to an end, because I wanted to get my doctorate so I could teach. And so after I finished that, it was 5 years. And I stayed on for a teaching fellowship for, 2 extra years after I had mostly finished things. I thought, okay, I'm finally done. I'm going to go on and be a professor. And I did that for 3 years until I was recruited by Renaissance Periodization to be a coach. And I coached part-time while I was teaching for a year, and then realized I really needed to kind of pick one. and the coaching was incredibly fulfilling, and an area where I thought I could grow and learn and be creative. And so it was actually Mike Israetel from Renaissance Periodization that recommended that I start talking about gut health, because this was back in 2017, and it seemed like it was kind of just an emerging trend. And he said, "Don't you have your PhD in something like this?" And I was like, "Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much exactly this. I guess I can talk about it." And so I did my first podcast with Steve Hall from Revive Stronger in, I think, June 2017. And then I had, one more podcast the next month, and then 2 the month after that. And then all of a sudden, like 7 podcasts in a week. And I've learned not to do that because it tires me out. But it's just been sort of an exponential growth, of interest in the field. And I just happened to have done my doctorate in it. And I finished that in 2014, and people weren't really excited about it yet.
And some of the stuff you were talking about, and you said, I love the name of your business, Vitamin PhD. I think it's such a great name.
Thank you. It was, it's kind of evolved over time. Like initially it was vitamin PhD. It was like, get your daily dose of evidence-based information. And my coaching approach and obviously coaching framework has changed since then, because when I started my Instagram and when I started my blog, it was just to provide information. I mean, I wasn't coaching yet when I started everything. And then I thought, okay, well, I want this information to actually, help people. And so my messaging started to change a little bit. And I've actually recently rebranded, I guess I would say. Now I'm completely independent, and Vitamin PhD is my thing now. So I had it as sort of my side business for a while. And I thought, there's more to it than giving people information. Mm-hmm. And as my messaging has changed, but a lot of my content is still stable. I mean, I still talk about gut health and the gut microbiome, but I do it in a way now that is hopefully empowering to people and without invalidating their experiences. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if a person has gone and gotten a food sensitivity test, or some other test that might not be valid, it's not super helpful to say, well, that was wrong. Those aren't valid. That's not a useful test, because they need and deserve validation of their experiences first. And so I've been talking about this for a while, and I've had a few podcast hosts that said, you really mix science and compassion so well. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh gosh, that really resonates with me. Compassion is definitely one of my main values. Mm-hmm. And as I was thinking about how I want to, redo my website finally after 4 years, because it kind of looked like a sixth grader's portfolio project before, I was like, I want to express what I'm about. And I still want it to be like, it's a vitamin, it's something that you can take. It's a supplement. And I was thinking about, what are words that are associated with vitamins and minerals, and fortification and enrichment came to mind. And then I realized, it just hit me one day, science fortified with compassion. So that's my aim now. That's my mission.
And you mentioned there about that your previous approach was kind of almost just to give information. And so how has that changed? What is it that you do now then?
I still give information, but now it's with permission. So I like to borrow from the motivational interviewing course that I did with Shannon, who was on with you several podcasts ago. So motivational interviewing, for people who don't know, very basically, it's a way of being with someone. It's a set of skills, but they are embodied by a specific spirit. And a little more specifically, it's a way of having a conversation about change with someone. Mm. It's not a way to get someone to change. It's just a way to create a space where they feel comfortable talking about it, knowing that they are accepted whether they change or not. And so when I give information, it comes later in the conversation. It comes at a time when they're ready to create a plan. And my information helps to supplement their learning journey. And I didn't even come up with supplement. That was Bill Miller and Steve Rolnick and Teresa Moyer. So I loved that, though, that this is my expertise has a specific place and a role, but it is as a supplement to their journey. It enriches their journey and it keeps them informed. So whatever choice they make, they're doing that with the best information, whether it's about nutrition or gut health. And so they are still in the driver's seat, and they have a really great map of where they might want to go.
And how has that changed, both from your point of view, the experience for the client and the experience for you?
I think it was an adjustment for both parties. And I have had some clients that I've been working with now for 4 years. And, they've said that they can tell that the approach has changed. And they really like it. They've enjoyed the process. And I've been transparent about it the whole time to say, I know that I had done things this other way before. And, I feel that this other way is better and more effective. And they know that what I'm doing is empirically based. It's evidence-based. It's something that we find in the literature. These are effective practices. And also, I feel that they're more authentic to the way that I like to interact with people. But it did take an adjustment on my part to really reflect on who I thought I should be as a coach. And I think it's something I think a lot of coaches go through, that we are initially, I think, sort of programmed to operate as the experts that are providing information and telling people what to do. And sometimes clients will come to us with that expectation and say, tell me what to do. And so right off the bat, it's really important to validate their experience. I know that you've had, experiences like this before. Find out what works for them, and then have a conversation where you can meet in the middle about, your shared expectations. And here's how I view myself as a coach. I'm your travel guide. Tell me where you want to go. We can talk about the ways to get there, and I'll make sure that it is safe and only relatively bumpy. And and you share with me your unique experiences and expertise. And I think where I found it like the most tangible was in the conversation. So when you're doing telehealth, and you've kind of shifted from providing a lot of information to instead, reflecting a lot and asking questions, sometimes there are some more pregnant pauses because the client is waiting for you to tell them something. And all you've done is you've reflected something back to them, to show that you understand. And it's just waiting for them to give you more information. But that has really smoothed over time. And I also now ask fewer questions than I did even when I started changing my approach, because sometimes that can turn into just an information seeking mission, and the client thinks, okay, I have to give you this information. But when you can reflect really skillfully and show that understanding, that is still an invitation for them to give you more information and for them to start giving you more change talk or sustained talk, depending on, where they are in their balance of sort of ambivalence and desire to change. And I think with clients, it can be an understandable adjustment, and sometimes maybe a little bit maybe uncomfortable, because they might not have had experiences like that in the past where they were really in the driver's seat. And so there's, also I think it needs to be a very open level of communication about where my expertise fits in versus where their expertise fits in. And that even if I gave them the most scientific, evidence-based, super duper fantastic nutrition plan, if it was totally unrealistic for them, then they would have a hard time adhering to it. And then they might feel that they're incapable, or they would blame themselves. And if I am a really judgmental person, I'll tell them oh, you don't want it bad enough or something. And that's just not a helpful dynamic for anyone. So, it's just about having those conversations about what are about our shared purpose and finding meaning in coach versus client, and, how we view ourselves in the dynamic, and, always having an unconditional positive regard and acceptance and empathy and compassion. And what I found that's a very new development is that people have expressed that the way that they talk to themselves is different, because they're starting to internalize the way that I regard them. And I think that's really one of the most beautiful things that I could hear, and not something that I really heard when I was starting off, with nutrition coaching and providing information, and more sort of prescriptive ways of coaching.
I find it interesting when you refer to yourself as a coach, and yet we know that you're a doctor. And so I would imagine it's not an approach that many doctors take, or I could be wrong on that. What's your thoughts on that?
I don't, I guess I always joke. I'm I'm not that kind of doctor. I think it's really important to practice humility and realize that my title is a reflection of a lot of dedication and work ethic and time and energy investment, and a passion for learning and a value of education. But it doesn't place me like above anyone on some like hierarchy of human quality, or worth. And I think that is partly, that's maybe why I'm drawn to motivational interviewing and positive psychology, because I think that is a very charitable and fulfilling and even like mentally healthful perspective of other humans to say, I think that people are inherently valuable and worthwhile as humans, and that humans are generally capable of change and are generally born capable of doing really great things, but we're also very vulnerable to influences that might make us do harmful things to ourselves or others, but that we have the capacity to make changes. That doesn't necessarily mean that we'll decide to make the changes, and that's okay too. But I think that the way that I leverage my education and being a doctor is that I have I've been vetted in a way, by the U.S. education system and my peers and colleagues to say that I do have expertise in this field, and that compared to someone who has not studied in the field, I probably have some more insights than they do. And so that's kind of how I couch it, that this is my area of expertise and this is how I can best supplement your journey, because I'll be able to tell you, hey, those tests are not accurate, and I know exactly why. Here are the real limitations based on how, this research technique actually works. And so it's a tool, but it's not something that, puts me in charge of clients or gives me the agency to tell them what to do.
When you're trying to help clients make changes, I'm wondering how, for yourself, have you ever had trouble making changes in your own life at any stage?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I still do. I mean, it's just a human experience. Ambivalence is the wanting of two things that are seemingly at odds. It's just a very human thing, because we have a hard time of really predicting what we're going to do in the future. And we have sometimes a hard time accepting what we've done in the past. And we have a hard time making changes. Like we are, to some extent, we are creatures of habit. We do lots and lots of things habitually every day. We do lots of things on autopilot every day. And we also have a hard time, in some cases, establishing new habits or breaking old ones. And I think to some extent that could be perhaps because we have some inaccurate beliefs or misconceptions about what it takes to make changes. So, for example, people talk often about needing more self-control or needing more self-discipline or more motivation. And none of those things are like mono constructs that you can like turn up and down like a volume knob. And like self-control, for example, is not even really associated very closely with people use it around food a lot. Oh, I wish I had more self-control so I would not eat this food. And self-control does exist. There are various definitions, but it's probably not the thing that we use to not eat food. There's like some other construct. But when we have those beliefs, I just don't have self-control. I just can't be trusted around this one food. Then we may end up developing some maladaptive coping mechanisms. And where we see this manifesting with food is that people will restrict that food. It'll be an off-limits food. It's not allowed in the house. They can't be around it. But it's a food that they really desire. And so when they are inevitably around that food, they eat it in uncomfortable amounts because they are predicting inaccurately that they won't be eating that food again. And so this is sort of the Last Supper effect. And then, then the cycle kind of just repeats over and over again. And so counterintuitively, often the solution to that is not more restriction, but it's actually liberation from restriction and habituation to that food. So we start to increase our exposure to it and give ourselves permission to eat it. And along with other practices like mindfulness and making sure that our emotional needs are met, over time, we end up just being okay with being around that food. So this was something that actually I had done with peanut butter. So I'll go ahead. I'll share my peanut butter story because I think a lot of people can relate to this one. I had a history of disordered eating when I was in college and grad school, and competed as a weight class athlete and once even as a physique athlete. And those are both high risk sports for eating pathology. Mm-hmm. And I got to a place where I felt very out of control around peanut butter. And if I had it in the house, I would just eat the whole jar, regardless of how I felt. It was just that I thought, okay, I'm not going to eat peanut butter again after this for a long time. So I'm just going to get it out of the way, just get it out of the house. And I thought, well, okay, that's not super effective. So how can I make this peanut butter less accessible? Maybe I'll modify my food environment. And that can be effective. And so in this case, I froze my peanut butter. And it did help me to not eat that jar of peanut butter because it was frozen, but it was really sort of a Band-Aid on that habit loop. And whenever I was around other sources of peanut butter, I would eat an uncomfortable amount. And I thought, how am I going to get out of this? Like, am I going to have to freeze my peanut butter forever? And I ended up attending a seminar by Nancy Clark, who is a sports dietitian, and she's really well known and a pretty prolific dietitian. And she was talking about eating pathology in athletes to it's just a small part of the overall presentation. But what really got me was she said, if you have an athlete that really loves a food, invite them to eat the food at every meal. And I thought, could I eat peanut butter at every meal? Oh my gosh. Like maybe I thought, nothing else has worked. I'm just going to go ahead and eat peanut butter at every meal. It's going to be a tiny amount of peanut butter. I still had to, at that time, hit my macros, but I was going to eat peanut butter at every meal. And I did that. And it did not take long before I was like, I don't think I like peanut butter as much as I thought I liked peanut butter. And it was a concerted effort. I was like, we need peanut butter every meal until I got to the point where I thought, okay, I don't really care about peanut butter. I can take it or leave it. And so I was able to have peanut butter in the house, not frozen, just in my pantry. And I did this habitually over the course of several years with a bunch of different foods. And now it's things that at that time, 7 years ago or so, I never thought that I'd be able to have in the house. Cereal, cookies, peanut butter, whatever, like 2 pints of ice cream. I just know I can eat that whenever I want. And when I eat those things, I do it while I'm paying attention. And if it's not something I really enjoy, I don't have to finish it. So that was one change that I found to be really difficult to make, but it did take challenging, my beliefs, and then also really accepting outcomes that were outside of my control. I wasn't sure how the peanut butter experiment was going to go, but I had to be open to whatever outcome would be, would result from that. So that's something I work on a lot with clients, is that we help to kind of foundationally, we establish what's really important, determining their values, and move through challenging some of those beliefs that can keep them stuck in cycles.
And I guess some of them must be quite surprised when you say you give them permission to, keep on eating that. They must be quite surprised.
I can't even say that I necessarily give them permission, because I can tell them you have permission to eat any food, and they have to give themselves permission.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, an understandable challenge, because people are often very fearful that if they give themselves permission to eat, then they will eat everything forever without stopping. And, the other side of that fear is that they'll gain weight from it. And in some cases, the fear of weight gain is so significant that they feel stuck in that place of, kind of losing out on quality of life because they're afraid of the repercussions of eating more and gaining weight. And that's a fear that I dealt with too. And it's part of of existing in a culture that judges weight gain and stigmatizes it and stigmatizes larger bodies. And so, even people who are in normative bodies that could, even if they did gain weight, they would still be in a normative body. It's just the fear of weight gain that is, another thing to discuss, another belief that has to be examined and evaluated and really kind of dig down deep and see, is that something that we can make space for? Because it's really a necessary part of the process that it is, in this case, it's weight neutral. Not all interventions for people who are trying to, establish an adaptive relationship with food are going to be weight neutral. But this is one example where we just kind of have to say, to be transparent, I can't tell you what's going to happen to your body along the way. And it's a huge act of courage for people to do that, because there's so much fear attached to what could happen.
And talking on that issue, I believe you've got some webinars coming up around that kind of subject.
Yes. So Shannon and I started the Bridging the Gap article series at the beginning of 2020. Really, it started before that, and then we published it. It took us a long time to write the first article. So the first article was meant to really be just kind of a short blog that I felt impassioned to write because I was watching people who didn't know anything about intuitive eating, and I mean the intuitive eating framework developed by Tribole and Resch, didn't know anything about it, and they were debating about its utility and its application. And they were doing it from a place of misinformation and misapplication. And I thought, well, that is not a useful conversation, and if we want to determine whether this actually works and for what, we have to be correct about its intended applications before we say it's not going to work. So that was part of it. And then the other aspects were, I was at this time, I was on my own journey of learning about and practicing mindful eating and interoceptive awareness, which is our ability to accurately identify the internal sensations that we're experiencing. And I realized that there was this overlap between the interoceptive awareness that we practice with like mindful eating and intuitive eating and autoregulation, which is very much on the opposite end of that is like hardcore. That's like sports science, when we're talking about a progressive periodized training program, that autoregulation is based on our ability to judge our rate of perceived exertion in an exercise. It's literally us saying on a scale of like 5 to 10, how much did this suck? It was a 9. And that is a completely subjective, intuitive process. And so I thought, well, maybe I can bridge the gap here and say, hey, we're using the same skill in all of these ways. So you over on this side of the debate, and you over on this side of the debate, see what we have in common. And then it turned into this huge, 10-page article where we talked about that. And then we talked about, the misconceptions around the diets don't work and metabolically healthy obesity and, the long-term statistics of long-term weight management. And we just took this huge deep dive. And then months later, we ended up at a place with 4 articles and what was kind of the first iteration of the comprehensive coaching framework, because we thought, well, is there not a way that we can help people with weight neutral or weight focused goals? Can't we meet in the middle and just work with clients to help them reach their place of flourishing health? And that's where that model came from. And then as we were writing about this, people started asking, oh, is this from a webinar? Are you guys going to do a presentation? And we were like, no, we're just writing because this is fun. And then all of a sudden we were like, we're going to do a webinar. And so we did that last year in October. It was a 3-part webinar series. So we talked about the origins, that first paper, and then our sort of the process and the application of the comprehensive coaching framework. And we were really fortunate that we had feedback from people who are real experts, psychologists, sports psychologists, who could give us feedback and say, here's how you might refine the model. And so we did that. So it's always been this iterative framework that we're changing based on empirical evidence, based on feedback, based on our experiences. And so we are putting that out again here in a few weeks. So beginning of April, we're going to be putting that series out again, and with updates, of course, because that's what we do. We can't ever say like anything is done. And Shannon has also put out a really excellent series of webinars on body image, and we continue to, write articles. So I have 2 more now they've taken a more sociocultural and sort of historical look at the origins of dieting and diet culture. And we have some more in the works for clients and coaches taking a look at our what we call the intentional eating spectrum. So it is a way to help clients kind of orient themselves toward an approach to nutrition based on their experiences, goals, and preferences. And not to say that one way is better than the other, because all ways have their pros and cons. And so webinars on that, and who knows what else the future holds.
Well, we'll put details of all of the webinars in the show notes, but what are the dates for the webinars?
So it's going to be every Thursday from starting on April 8th. So those 3 Thursdays in a row. And then the following 2 Thursdays, we're going to be having our practical application sessions. So those are sort of like small group sessions where people can come in and ask questions and brainstorm. And we actually walk people through sort of like a real step-by-step process of how we engage with our clients with that model. And we also have the Comprehensive Coaching Facebook community. So that is a small but growing group of actually coaches and clients who come together to have conversations about these topics. And when we are hosting some of our, we do a monthly Q&A with them as well. So they get access to that. And so, lots of kind of first, like one-on-one attention, and we both provide mentoring as well. So we're just trying to help people help other people.
So the Comprehensive Coaching Facebook group you mentioned, who would that be relevant for? What kind of people?
It would be, we are probably, we're I would say it's maybe a 3-to-1 ratio of coaches to clients at the moment. But it's really any coach that feels like they are kind of stuck in the middle between a weight focus versus weight neutral approach. They're trying to find their voice, and they are looking for some context, behind the claims, like that the, really divergent claims and sort of like loud voices in the industry are making. And we have some coaches that are concerned. They don't want to cause harm, but they want to help their clients and meet their clients where they are. So coaches who are kind of facing that, and then any clients who want to share their experiences, because that is really one of the those voices are important, especially for new coaches to hear from a client. And then we also, I'm partnering with some trainers who are establishing a website that will help to connect practitioners and clients and patients. And they are in our group asking for feedback. And so we're getting feedback from both coaches and clients. So if that's something that people would want to be involved with starting in April, that would be another great way to connect and collaborate too.
Time is flying, and it often seems to in these episodes. But I wanted to dig into some of your, before the episode, I asked you about books that you would recommend.
Oh, yeah.
And I wanted to go deep in that, but I don't think we're going to have time to go deep. But you did, you've got some books that you said that you do recommend. So do you want to just sort of talk about those books and the reason why that you recommend them?
Absolutely. I'll try to remember all 3 that I recommended, but I know one was Mome by Michael Ende. He wrote The Never Ending Story. And actually, I just read that book. It was recommended by a client of mine that I've been working with for a long time. And the reason she recommended it was it was an indirect recommendation, but she actually quoted it. And she quoted a section that explains that Momo's special skill was listening. And the way that she listened to people helped them feel more capable. And I was just so touched that she shared that. And so it's a young adult book. I mean, it's for like kids. But it is about, it's a story about how time is made and spent. And I think it serves as a really valuable and helpful reminder that we can all be sort of victims of time theft and time famine. depending on how we're spending our time. And so I thought that was just a really great book, and it reminds me to slow down sometimes when I can. The other one I know was a Kurt Vonnegut book. I want to say it was Breakfast of Champions. It was. Yeah. So it could probably be like any Kurt Vonnegut book. I love Slaughterhouse-Five. I love Face Worse Than Death. I love Breakfast of Champions. I picked Breakfast of Champions because I think Vonnegut's writing, even though he was writing in like the 1960s and 1970s, it's still very poignant. It is still really relevant. And he just talks about like the human condition in society and how frustrated sometimes he was, but how entertained he was too at just how ridiculous humans can be. And so he wrote sort of science fiction and he wrote, about like politics and government, but in a really like kind of, I don't know, like just a funny, like dry humor type of way. And there's some really like hilarious illustrations in there too. He never took himself too seriously, which I really appreciate. So that was one of them. And then I can't remember what the third book was.
The last one was Modern Food, Moral Food.
Oh, yeah. So Modern Food, Moral Food. So this was written by, I want to say she's a food anthropologist.
Helen.
Helen Zoe Veit. Yep. So this was a really cool book. It's actually about the intersection of, it's kind of like how self-control met calorie counting, met striving for a smaller body. And so it is a historical account of the rise of like how posh it is to count calories and sort of the origins of dieting culture. So that's a really great place to get started. If you want to learn more, there's another book called Paradox of Plenty by Harvey Levenstein. It's a little bit longer and a little bit more of a textbook kind of read, but they're actually both, I think they're both textbooks. So those would be my recommendations for kind of getting into the history. And I also have referenced that article in two of my articles on the Bridging the Gap website that talk about the history of and moralization of food and body and health.
I get the impression that's another thing you have in common with Shannon, just like you read so many books.
Yeah. I usually am reading a few at a time. So I'll have like a book that I'm reading for fun. And then I'll have other books that I read for content creation and education. And so, Shannon and I have like a huge compilation of like reference, research articles and books and whatnot. And I'm constantly adding to my list. So I have like, Nietzsche and a whole slew of other like philosophy books too, that I'm like, oh, I'll read these, when I'm on the beach next week.
Well, I mean, I would like to ask you so many more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. So if people want to find out more about you and what you do, where's the best places to go? Yeah,
they can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Vitamin PhD. My website is vitaminphdnutrition.com. And if they want to see more of the Bridging the Gap work, that's btgcomprehensivecoaching.com.
And finally, have you got a quotation that you like, I believe?
Yes. So I always just use the latter half of this quotation. And to give some context, this was Kurt Vonnegut speaking about his uncle. And he said that one of the things he really liked about his uncle was that when he was having a good time, when he was in just a really lovely moment, he would look around and say, if this isn't nice, what is? And I think that is a really sweet reminder to notice those nice moments, those little sort of mundane things that might go by unnoticed if we don't make a concerted effort to be grateful for them.
That's really nice. Well, Gabrielle, it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you very much for being a guest on the show, and I'm sure people are going to love what you've been sharing with them.
I'm glad to hear that, and the feeling is mutual, so I thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Next week is episode 10, and we welcome back Vicky Rouchet. She was on the podcast sometime last year, and I've invited her back again because one of the things that's obviously happened in the last year, there's been a lot of stress and anxiety over the various lockdowns and so on. And that obviously affects health, anxiety and stress. And something else that affects stress, that really increases stress, is anxiety over finances and money. And this is an area where Vicky is a real expert. And so we really dig into this, and she gives some really good habits on ways that we can help to improve our financial situation, whatever that may be for different people. So that's next week's episode number 10 with Vicky Wouche. If you know anyone who you feel would really benefit from some of the advice that Gabrielle shared with us, please do share the episode with them. Why not take a screenshot and share it to them, or maybe just send them a link to the podcast. Please do leave a review. Why not subscribe? And I hope you have a great week.